Sultan Muhammad al-Khamis didn't only unite the Berbers and the Arab Muslims, he even looked after the interest of the Jewish Moroccans. And as we know, in Morocco there's a long history of Judaism, a long history of Judaism. At the time when the French were also leaning towards a Nazi ideology, okay, there was a time when the French were also leaning towards a Nazi ideology and propaganda, and they insisted that the Moroccan Sultan sign a decree known as the Vichy laws, which would discriminate against the Germans, against the Jews, and also endorse sending Jews to the camps to be exterminated. The Moroccan king refused outright, and he protected 250,000 Jewish people from being killed and being discriminated. That's the history we need to make known. That's the history we need to make known. And when we see what we're seeing today, and we look at how the Muslims behaved to the Jews and protected them, not just in antiquity, even in recent times, when the Nazis in the Second World War and in that period, and the French and the others who also were pro-Nazi, there was a point when America was actually pro-Nazi. They were supporting the Germans in the media. Okay, there was a point when that was happening. Okay, it was the Muslim king in North Africa who said, no, we're not going to endorse this. We're not going to discriminate against the Jews in Morocco, and we're not going to give them up either to be massacred and killed. Okay, so here you can see Times of Israel, and I chose this website specifically because if I chose a Muslim website, there could be the issue of it's just bias, it's not the real information. But when he died, they officially recognized and they honored him for what he did for the Jewish people in North Africa. Okay, 250,000 people. We have movies about Schindler, right? Where's the movie about the King of Morocco? 250,000 people. 250,000 people were saved. That's why it's important for us to do the history, to seek history, to learn history, so we can defend ourselves and also to show the world that no, we are not the anti-Semites you're telling us we are. In fact, we are the most pro-Semites you could think on earth, because when they were being persecuted in Germany, which we're going to get into today, actually, it was the Muslim lands that gave safe haven. It was in those lands that you were able to go and remain and not be harassed and not be killed and not be persecuted. Right? So it's an important piece of history, and I think we need to highlight this, you know. And he was vocal about it. There was a conference in Casablanca in 1943. The French were in attendance, and he openly spoke up for the Jewish people. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that. But that's the spirit of Islam. These are people, 𝗾𝙗𝙗, that we look after them when they live amongst us, you know, which subverts a narrative, a wicked narrative, that arises in 48 when Ben Gurion of Israel calls for the Jewry of the world to come to Palestine, to Israel, because they need people to populate it. He was calling for 600,000 people to come every single year to make hijrah, or aliyah, that's what they call aliyah, we call it hijrah, to populate, on the pretext that the Jewish people around the world, especially the Muslim world, were being persecuted day and night. That was a pretext. And I could show you, I did a documentary a couple of months ago, the documents and the propaganda saying that there's an immediate threat, an imminent threat for the Jews in Africa and in Asia and in Arabia because the Muslims are killing them. A complete lie. A complete lie. But that lie was necessary in order to justify populating Palestine with foreigners. And I'm very passionate because I think oftentimes we are forced to justify our stance towards other people, and we have to apologize. Right? Muslims are anti-Semites, they've been persecuted Jews, and because we don't have the answers from history, we don't study, we end up trying to find a long and convoluted way to explain things off. You don't have to go that far. History is just evidence, it's just literally around the corner. You don't have to go very far. The other thing was also that the Jewish community is not monolithic. You have the Ashkenazim, these are the people who are typically in Europe. They're indigenous Europeans. The Ashkenazim, they're the majority in Israel right now, by the way. Then you have the Sephardic Jews. They were the Jews who were in Al-Andalus, and spent hundreds of years with us. And when we left Al-Andalus and went to North Africa as Muslims, where did they go? They followed us. And the Ottomans also sent ships for them to come to the Ottoman mainland to protect them, preserve them, and to honor them. This is why Ahmed Yasin, rahimahullah, when he spoke in the video,
احنا ما بنكره اليهود ونقاتل اليهود لأن اليهود أهل دين واحنا أهل دين. احنا بنحب كل أهل الأديان. احنا بنحب كل أهل الأديان. احنا بنحب كل أهل الأديان. أخويا هذا اللي من أمي وأبويا اللي دينه مسلم إذا أخذ بيتي وقربني منه أنا بقاتله. أنا بقاتل أخويا، بقاتل ابن عمي إذا أخذ أرضي وبيتي وقربني. فلما اليهودي يأخذ أرضي وبيتي وقربني منها كمان أنا مستعد أقاتل.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, Jews came from all over the Jewish world, from Europe, from North Africa, from Yemen, in small numbers due to the harsh conditions.
It would be nice to get a definition of what the Jewish world is, which geographical regions were encompassed by this imaginary realm, and when did they come into existence. As a matter of fact, the historical account is that there is no Jewish world. The global Jewish population prior to 1948 was in fact dispersed and divided along the lines of geographical, historical and ethnic lines. They do not share the same outlook on world history, nor have all Jews inherited the same traumatic experiences that continue to haunt the European Jews, who now make up the vast majority of those who reside in the Zionist state of Israel. The Jewish world, if ever there was such a thing, includes three main categories of people. They are the Mizrahim, the Sephardic, and the Ashkenazi, who are often known as the Hasidic Jews. The first category are the Mizrahim, also known as the Oriental Jews. These people originate primarily from Iraq, Persia, and Yemen, but can often be found in North Africa in regions such as Morocco. The Mizrahim have never left the Middle East or North Africa, and continue to inhabit the various regional enclaves and lands in and around Palestine, as they have since the beginning of biblical times. They are by no means to be confounded or equated with the European Jewish community. This is a mistake that is far too often perpetuated by the masses, and only serves to give European Jews an instrument of deception that many Zionists use to cloak and conceal their real identity and true origins, thereby claiming legitimacy and a right to the ancestral inheritance of the true Jews. The Mizrahim Jewish community has had a long history and record in Muslim Arab society. They lived among Muslims for over 1400 years and share many customs and traditions with neighboring Arab tribes. The Habbani Jews of Yemen, for example, are nearly indistinguishable from the Yemeni Muslims in their attire, language and customs. This close proximity to Arab Muslim society is further strengthened by the fact that Mizrahim women are permitted to marry into Arab Muslim families, and that this practice is possible and acceptable according to the guidelines in the Quran itself. Ironically, it was only after they were invited into the Zionist states in 1948 that the Mizrahim Jews faced severe discrimination and marginalization, not from the Arabs, but from their European Hasidic Jewish counterparts, who looked down on the Middle Eastern Jews as inferior. The same treatment was directed towards the Ethiopian Jewish community, known as Beta Israel. These people also arrived in Israel in 1948 and continued to be mistreated and subjected to racial abuse by their European Jewish neighbors. We must now stress the fact that the experience and outlook of the indigenous Jews, whose ancestral line has been unbroken and uninterrupted since biblical times, is naturally very different to that of the European Jewish community, whose history is fraught with violence and trauma, which was inflicted upon them by their Christian neighbors in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Britain, France, Italy, Spain and Portugal. A traumatic collective experience that the Jewish European community carries to this very day and wishes to superimpose upon others in order to pass it off as a Jewish global trauma induced by none other than the Arabs and Muslims. This, of course, is a false narrative and must be dismantled. The second category of Jews are the Sephardic Jews, who lived alongside the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, this being Spain and Portugal, under the reign and protection of successive Muslim dynasties from the days of the Umayyads to the Almorabbitun and Almuwahhidun, as well as the Nasrids. This community sits in between a European experience and a Middle Eastern reality. Again, the outlook and experience of these Jews is very different to that of the European Hasidic Jewish counterparts. During the waves of persecution in medieval Europe, many Sephardic Jews found a refuge in Muslim lands, as they were forced to convert to Catholicism or face expulsion from Spain after 1492. Sultan Bayezid II sent 𝗾𝗏𝗟 to save the Sephardic Jews of Spain in 1492 by granting them permission to settle in the Ottoman Empire. Moses bin Maimun, also known as Maimonides or Rambam, was a Sephardic Jewish philosopher scholar who became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. In his time, he was also a preeminent astronomer and physician, serving as the chief personal physician of Sultan Salahuddin. He was born in Cordoba during the 𝗲𝗏𝗡𝗏 dynasty and became the head of the Jewish community in Egypt, where he died and is now buried in Fustat.
I find it absurd that people like my great-grandmother, who came to Israel from Eastern Europe in the 1920s, after dreaming about the Jewish homeland for generations, are seen as white colonialists.
Now we come to the last and the most significant group, those who spearheaded and championed the Zionist movement from its very inception and continue to do so today. These are the Ashkenazi Hasidic Jewish diaspora. We must stress the fact that about half of the Jewish population worldwide today identifies as Ashkenazi, meaning that they are descended from Jews who originate from Central or Eastern Europe. The term was initially used to define a distinct cultural group of Jews who settled in the 10th century in Rhineland in Western Germany. The Hasidic community is distinct from all other Jewish groups in their genetic and customary makeup. Studies have also shown and proven that they trace their ancestry and genetic bond to the Germanic and Eastern European bloc. Unlike Mizraim and Sephardic Jews or even the Ethiopian community, the Ashkenazi have experienced intolerable discrimination and persecution throughout the centuries preceding 1948. This culminated in Germany's extermination camps in the early 20th century. Naturally, this community of Jews has had a very different outlook on world history, and they are far more impacted by the horrors and tragedies associated with being a Jew in the Western world. However, they have spun this narrative around by seeking to vilify and blame the Arabs and Muslims for all their suffering, identifying Arabs and Muslims as the chief perpetrators of these horrible crimes, which is not historically accurate nor ethically sound. What we are witnessing today in Palestine is a retribution of a European Jewry whose past traumatic experience in Europe has driven them to the limits of desperation and cruelty. Their cold-heartedness and resolve to destroy and demolish any perceived threat to their existence was caused not by the Arab Palestinians nor by the Muslims of this world, but by the very European nations who today stand as proud allies and supporters of the Zionist project. In short, the Hasidic Ashkenazi Jewish community is a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, and they seek to cure it by punishing the Arabs.
In Morocco in 1948, there were 265,000 Jews. Today there are around 2,000. In Iraq, there were 135,000 Jews in 1948. Today there are fewer than 10. Algeria used to be home to 140,000 Jews. Today there are fewer than 50, and I can go on. It is Muslim countries who perpetrated ethnic cleansing on the Jews.
Now that we have dispelled and dismissed the monolithic myth of a global Judeo-cultural and historical experience, let us investigate a bit closely his claims of a Muslim-Arab purge of Jewish populations, which resulted in their mass migration towards Jerusalem in 1948. The truth is that before Israel's declaration of independence in 1948, approximately 800,000 Jews were living in lands that are now considered the modern Arab world. A further 200,000 Jews lived in Pahlavi, Iran, and the Republic of Turkey. The sum total of all of these communities is estimated to be around 1 million. These were Jewish communities who were indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. They were by no means newcomers, nor were they kicked out of their ancestral homes in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Morocco, and other places. What Zionists seek to do is to misinterpret the reality of what really happened from 1948 onwards. After independence, the Zionist establishment, headed by the first Israeli Prime Minister and the architect of the mass migration program, David Ben-Gurion, presented the Knesset with a plan to double the Jewish population within just 4 years. This meant bringing in 600,000 migrants in a 4-year period, or 150,000 per year. Absorbing 150,000 newcomers annually under the trying conditions facing the new state was a heavy burden indeed. The first large-scale exodus took place in the late 1940s and in the early 1950s. Jews came from Iran, Iraq, Yemen and Libya. In these cases, over 90% of the Jewish population left the countries, heading towards Israel. In fact, very few Jews from Muslim nations and Arab nations left their country during the British Mandate period. Around 900,000 Jews from Muslim-majority nations in West Asia, North Africa, and to a lesser extent Central Asia, Southern Asia and Southwest Asia in the 20th century packed up and left their countries in response to the creation of Israel and the invitation of the Prime Minister of Israel. Up to 600,000 Jews from the Arab and neighboring regions reached Israel by 1972. According to researchers and scholars, there are two major factors for the Zionist mass immigration movements of the 1940s. The first was initiated in 1944 by Ben-Gurion when he called for bringing in 1 million Jews to Palestine, even if public soup kitchens had to be set up to feed them. The second drive was to extend the call for migration to include the indigenous Jews who were already living amongst the Arabs and the Muslims in surrounding nations. Opponents in the Jewish Agency and the government of mass immigration argued that there was no justification for organizing large-scale immigrations among Jews whose lives were not in danger, particularly when the desire and motivation were not their own. The historical record speaks for itself. These were not Jews who were being expelled from the Arab lands. They were ideologically and economically incentivized to leave and travel to Jerusalem on the orders and command of the Jewish Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, whose objective was to bolster up the Jewish population in 4 years.
800,000 Jews were brutally expelled from Muslim countries. For some reason, no one cares about them or want to tell their story. Millions of articles and papers have been written about the Palestinians who had to evacuate their homes because of a war they started, yet very little has been written about the Jews living in Muslim countries who were subjected to pogroms and had to flee, even though they were innocent.
Now that we've dispelled another myth concerning the so-called expulsion of Jews from the Muslim lands, we come to the issue of pogroms and persecution. It is rather ironic that he claims that it was the Arabs who subjected the Jewish populations to pogroms in their lands. The Arabs being blamed for pogroms even though they cannot pronounce the letter P is as asinine as it gets. But that is beside the point. In actuality, pogroms were widespread in Europe and Russia. The term itself originated from the Russian language and entered the English lexicon later on. It describes a mass purge of Jewish people, particularly in the European Christian world. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, new types of anti-Semitism developed across Europe. In the Russian Empire, many waves of violent and deadly riots targeting Jews were recorded, as were others across the European realms. The Odessa pogroms, lasting between 1821 to 1905 in Ukraine, were examples of this. Others included the Warsaw pogrom in 1881, the Kishinev pogrom in Moldova in 1903, the Kiev pogrom in Ukraine in 1905, the Białystok pogrom in Poland in 1906, the Lwów pogrom in Ukraine in 1918, the Kiev pogrom again in 1919, and the Kristallnacht pogrom, the Night of the Broken Glass in Germany, on November 9th, 1938. This toxic and vitriolic European vice and sentiment towards the Jewish community, whom they referred to as Christ killers, prevailed long before the Holocaust. The 800,000 Jews who were so-called expelled and subject to pogroms in the Muslim world were in fact nothing less than economic and ideological migrants who were invited to Jerusalem. However, the Jews coming from Europe were the victims of these pogroms, and this is something he doesn't talk about in his video. It is well known that governments and churches across Europe imposed waves of restrictions on Jews, dictating where they could and couldn't live, which jobs and professions they could hold, even banning them from owning land and property, and at times forcing them to wear distinctive markings to make them social pariahs. In this period, European literature and media was saturated with anti-Semitic propaganda and conspiracy theories about Jewish families and their economic control over the financial world. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, being the most popular amongst these anti-Jewish conspiracies, was first published in Russia in 1903. The fictitious document was popularized outside Russia following the revolution in 1917 and spread rapidly towards continental Europe, where the Polish and German ideologues internalized the fear and hatred of Jews, culminating in the horrific events in the years to follow. These conspiracies, pogroms and vilification campaigns were not present in the Muslim Arab world at all. As a matter of fact, the Zionist movement was founded as a direct response to European anti-Semitism in the 19th century, long before the Holocaust. In actuality, many Jews were desperate to leave Europe, and they channeled their hopes and ambitions towards establishing a new home in the Middle East.
Welcome to 𝗏𝗡𝗓𝗓, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. Discover the 𝗏𝗡𝗓𝗓 mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.𝗏𝗡𝗓𝗓𝗏𝗡.com.